At -30 degrees Fahrenheit, even breathing could kill you. Metal shattered when struck, skin froze in seconds, and wounded men didn't bleed, they crystallized. On the night of November 27, 1950, thousands of American Marines lay wrapped in sleeping bags beneath a moonless Korean sky, believing the war was nearly over. They were wrong. What they didn't know, what no one had told them, was that tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers were already in motion, silently descending from the surrounding mountains, preparing one of the most devastating ambushes in modern military history. This was the beginning of the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, a battle so brutal, so cold, and so costly that even today, it remains one of the least discussed horrors of the Korean War. The 1st Marine Division had been advancing steadily north, pushing toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. Optimism filled the command structure. If the weather held, senior leadership believed the conflict, officially referred to as a United Nations police action, might be concluded within weeks. Chinese intervention was considered unlikely, or at worst, minimal. The Marines had not faced serious resistance in over a month. Villages fell without a fight. Ridges were taken with ease. Confidence replaced caution. And it was in this state of guarded optimism that Marine units staged into a remote mountain valley called Udamanai, on the western edge of the frozen Chosin Reservoir. Throughout the daylight hours of November 27, elements of the 5th Marine Regiment, most of the 7th Marines, and artillery battalions from the 11th Marines maneuvered into position. The terrain was unforgiving, jagged ridgelines, narrow valleys, and steep hills that dominated every approach. Patrols were sent out to secure high ground, while other units conducted limited advances into what was believed to be unsecured territory. But something was wrong. For the first time in weeks, Marine patrols encountered determined resistance. Every sweep was contested. Every ridge line fought for. The enemy was there, watching, probing, measuring, but the scale of what was coming remained completely invisible. As night fell, temperatures plunged further. By 9 o'clock, most Marines were already asleep, exhausted by the cold and the relentless physical strain of mountain warfare. Boots were removed to prevent frostbite. Rifles were laid close, but not gripped. Udamanai was viewed as a temporary staging area, not a defensive stronghold. There was no continuous perimeter, only isolated pockets of Marines scattered across the surrounding hills, each holding ground based on the best intelligence available at the time. It wasn't negligence. It wasn't incompetence. It was a textbook response to what command believed the situation to be. Unfortunately, the situation had already changed. Nowhere did chance, and fate, play a greater role than with 2 isolated Marine companies from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Dog Company and Easy Company found themselves alone due to logistical limitations that plagued Marine divisions of the era. There simply weren't enough trucks to move the entire battalion at once. As a result, roughly 400 Marines were sent ahead to Udamanai on November 26, while the rest of their battalion remained behind, waiting for transport. These 2 companies, composed largely of reservists but hardened by earlier fighting along the Incheon-Seoul Highway, were placed on high ground east of the valley, Hill 1240 and Hill 1282, positions that would soon become killing grounds. The isolation was obvious to the men holding those hills. Patrols were dispatched immediately, probing the terrain, watching the ridgelines, listening to the silence. And that silence broke during the night. On Hill 1282, an Easy Company machine gunner spotted movement in the darkness. A single grenade ended the life of a Chinese officer who had unknowingly wandered into the Marine position. When his body was examined, the implications were chilling. Scattered around him were a plotting board, measuring tape, and navigation instruments. Papers identified him as an officer of the Chinese People's Liberation Army's 79th Division. This was no reconnaissance patrol. This was preparation for a major assault. The following morning confirmed those fears. Dog Company moved out to patrol north of Hill 1240 and quickly encountered Chinese troops. What was expected to be a routine movement turned into a sharp engagement near the ruined village of Kyaedong-Ni. Chinese forces, dug into high ground, unleashed heavy fire. Marine Corsair fighter bombers struck the village, but terrain and numbers favored the enemy. A platoon leader was wounded. Another was killed trying to hold his men together. Under mounting pressure, Dog Company was forced to withdraw under air and mortar cover, suffering multiple casualties in the process. The Chinese did not pursue far, they didn't need to. The trap was already set. By nightfall on November 27, both Dog and Easy companies were fully alert. Weapons were registered. Trip flares lined the approaches. Mortars were positioned. Machine guns covered every accessible route. No official warning had been issued, but the Marines knew something was coming. What they did not know was the scale. The 79th PLA Division, 3 regiments strong, had been assigned objectives across the hills surrounding Utameni. Due to darkness and unfamiliar terrain, Chinese units drifted off course, unknowingly redirecting entire regiments toward Marine-held positions they had not planned to assault. The result was chaos, and opportunity, on both sides. Shortly after 10 o'clock that night, Chinese soldiers began probing Easy Company's rear spur. A firefight erupted in the freezing darkness. Marines were wounded. Chinese squads were driven off. To the east, Dog Company was also tested. Phone lines crackled between company commanders as both made the same decision, to pull in patrols and brace for impact. The hills were no longer quiet. The war had arrived in force. And within hours, the frozen ridges of Chosin would become known by another name, the Hills of Hell. John Yancey had already lived more lives than most men ever would. At 24, he had fought through the jungles of Guadalcanal with Carlson's Raiders, one of the most elite units of the Pacific War. He had earned a Navy Cross, a battlefield commission, and a reputation for unshakable calm under fire. By 1950, he was 32, married, and running a liquor store in Little Rock, Arkansas, a man who had every reason to stay home. But when war came again, he volunteered without hesitation. On the frozen slopes of Hill 1282, First Lieutenant John Yancey found himself once more at the edge of history, commanding Easy Company's 1st platoon, about to face an enemy unlike any he had ever known. The second round of Chinese probes came quietly, just as the first had. Small groups approached, tested the Marine lines, and melted away after contact. Yancey wasn't alarmed. This was standard enemy behavior, reconnaissance by fire, an attempt to map positions. He ordered his machine gunners to hold their fire, refusing to give away their strongest assets. For a brief moment, it felt manageable. Controlled. Almost routine. Then the silence broke in a way no Marine there would ever forget. From the darkness came the sound of thousands of feet, sneaker soles crunching over frozen snow in perfect rhythm. It was not a rush. It was not chaos. It was deliberate, methodical, unstoppable. Above the sound of marching feet rose a single voice, chanting in heavily accented English. Nobody lives forever. You die. Over and over again, the words echoed across the hillside, drifting through the cold night air like a curse. To Yancey and his men, it sounded unreal, a psychological weapon as much as a threat. Yancey grabbed his sound-powered phone and whispered urgently to the company executive officer. The Chinese were building for a full assault. He asked for illumination and mortar fire, anything to break the darkness and slow what was coming. The response was grim. Ammunition was scarce. There would be little help. Then the line went quiet. All that remained was the sound of the approaching enemy and the chant that seemed to grow louder with every step. Index fingers rested on triggers. Men breathed shallowly, afraid that even sound might give them away. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, just after midnight, the trip flares ignited. The hill exploded into ghostly white light, and the Marines saw hell. The Chinese formations extended across the entire front, as far as the eye could see. Perfectly spaced, rank after rank, white-clad soldiers stood frozen in the sudden glare, each man 15 yards behind the one in front. At the head of the formation walked a lone officer, upright and fearless, shouting again and again, "Nobody lives forever. You die." It was a sight so overwhelming that it burned itself permanently into the memories of every Marine who witnessed it. Yancey leapt to his feet and shouted a challenge, but his voice vanished beneath the roar that erupted all at once, whistles, bugles, horns, and war cries crashing together as the Chinese charged. He slammed the phone down, fired an entire magazine from his M2 carbine at the officer leading the assault, and the Marine line erupted in gunfire. Mortars rained down, first long, then closer, forming a protective curtain as Chinese bodies fell in the snow. But the ammunition ran out quickly. The fire slackened. And still the enemy came. White shapes flowed through gaps in the line, darting between foxholes, closing to grenade range. Marines hesitated to fire, afraid of hitting their own men as the fight dissolved into brutal, close-quarters chaos. Captain Walter Phillips ran forward from the command post, bullets tearing into his arm and leg, refusing to go down. He found Yancey and his platoon sergeant moving constantly, jumping from hole to hole, shouting encouragement, forcing ammunition into frozen hands. Yancey himself was wounded, a grenade fragment had torn into the bridge of his nose. He could barely breathe, blood filling his throat, yet he kept moving, kept fighting. Nearby, First Lieutenant William Schreier, the mortar officer, found himself face to face with Chinese infantry pouring into the company area. He fired until grenades forced him to the ground. When he looked up, more were coming, dozens of them. Retreating uphill, he reached the command post just as it was being overrun. There were barely 10 Marines left standing there. No cover. No reserves. Grenades detonated in clusters, one after another, as if the enemy were carrying baskets of them into the fight. Schreier was hit repeatedly, arm, wrist, chest, but continued firing until he collapsed. Slowly, unbelievably, the Chinese assault faltered. Then it receded. The night fell into an uneasy quiet, broken only by scattered gunfire from frightened men on both sides shooting at shadows. In front of Yancey's platoon and throughout the perimeter, Chinese dead and wounded lay piled in the snow, some only feet from Marine positions. But the nightmare was far from over. 1,000 yards away, on Hill 1240, Dog Company was being torn apart. Repeated Chinese assaults smashed into their thin line, crushing platoons one by one. Leaders fell. Machine gunners were killed at their weapons. At one point, the entire company was forced into a headlong retreat down the slope. Captain Milton Hull physically placed himself between his men and annihilation, rallying them, forcing them to turn and fight their way back uphill. When a Chinese machine gun opened up in their rear, Hull shouted through the chaos, "Hold fast. It can't kill us all." Grenades silenced the gun, and Dog Company held, barely. Back on Hill 1282, disaster struck Easy Company. Reinforcements clawed their way to the summit only to find the command structure destroyed. Captain Phillips was dead. Lieutenant Ball was dead. Other officers lay wounded or missing. No one knew where Yancey was. In the wreckage of the command post, authority fell not to an officer, but to a platoon sergeant. Staff Sergeant Daniel Murphy took control without hesitation. He gathered whoever he could find, wounded, stragglers, riflemen from different platoons, and rebuilt a defensive line from nothing. He repositioned a machine gun, redistributed the last grenades, stripped bar magazines for rifle ammunition, and prepared his men for what he knew was coming next. Out of the darkness, the white-clad masses returned. On the far side of the shattered ridgeline, Lieutenant John Yancey took stock of what remained. 9 men. That was all. 9 Marines still capable of standing, breathing, and fighting beside him. Blood filled his mouth, freezing as it spilled onto his collar. His face was mangled, his body failing, but the instinct that had carried him through Guadalcanal was still alive. If these men were going to die, they would not die crawling. They would die on their feet. Hawking blood from his throat, Yancey summoned the last strength in his lungs and bellowed the old raider battle cry, a word learned years earlier in the Pacific, borrowed from the very language spoken by the enemy now overrunning the hill. Gung-ho. It meant work together. The irony was almost unbearable. The words rang out across Hill 1282, spoken in the Cantonese tongue of the Chinese soldiers surging across the summit. For a moment, time seemed to pause. 10 shattered Marines rose from the snow, fixed bayonets onto frozen rifles, and staggered forward. Their voices were thin, almost broken, but the cry cut through the night wind like a blade. Gung-ho. Firelight flickered across steel bayonets as they advanced. Then, in a split second, it ended. A Chinese soldier stepped from the darkness and fired a Thompson submachine gun point-blank into Yancey's face. 1.45 caliber round struck home, tearing through bone and flesh, blasting his left eye from its socket. Somehow still conscious, the astonished Marine shoved the dangling eye back into place and crawled blindly uphill, refusing to die where he had fallen. Gung-ho. But the line could not hold. The last counterattack collapsed, and Easy Company ceased to exist as a fighting force. By pure coincidence, the kind that decides history, salvation was already climbing the mountain. Elements of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, a reserve unit from Salt Lake City, reached the slopes of Hill 1282 just as the final organized resistance of Easy-2/7 was being crushed. They had not been sent to save Easy Company. They were not even supposed to be there. But war does not follow plans. Picking their way across the shattered terrain, Charlie-1/5 moved cautiously through darkness, stopping wounded Marines, collecting fragments of information, trying to understand what kind of nightmare they were walking into. It took them nearly 2 hours to reach the killing ground. Captain Jack Jones, their commander and point man, knew they had arrived when a burst of machine gun fire tore through the darkness in front of him. Jones linked up with Staff Sergeant Daniel Murphy, who had somehow kept a handful of Easy Company survivors alive on a narrow spur below the summit. Murphy, bloodied and exhausted, was still trying to form a defensive line from the wreckage. Neither man knew how many Marines were still alive on the far side of the hill, or how many Chinese waited above them. Conditions could not have been worse. No one had seen the terrain in daylight. Friendly positions were uncertain. The enemy's strength was unknown. Charlie-1/5 had already taken casualties just reaching the hill. Jones made the only rational decision left: he waited for dawn. Sunrise came like a revelation. As first light spilled into the valley, Marines looked skyward and saw salvation in steel and flame. Corsair fighter bombers and Navy sky raiders roared overhead, diving toward the summit. Napalm splashed across the reverse slopes, and machine gun fire raked Chinese positions. Marines pressed themselves into the frozen ground as aircraft passed so low they could see the wings flash past like blades. When the last aircraft pulled away, Captain Jones gave the order. Charlie-1/5 charged uphill into a storm of fire. 50 Chinese soldiers, all that remained of the 1st Battalion, 235th PLA Regiment, rose to meet them with machine guns and grenades. The Marines closed the distance anyway. What followed was savage, intimate, and merciless. Rifles became clubs. Bayonets found flesh. Men fought at arm's length, slipping on blood-stained snow. Within minutes, it was over. The last Chinese defenders were killed or driven off. The final platoon of Able-1/5 arrived to secure the summit, stepping over bodies frozen where they had fallen. Hill 1282 was back in Marine hands. Then, from among the dead, John Yancey emerged. His face was destroyed. Shrapnel cut across his nose and palate. His jaw was shattered. One eye spun wildly in its socket. He saluted the first Charlie Company officer he encountered and formally requested relief from command. His war was finished. Gathering 35 walking wounded Marines, Yancey led them slowly down the ravine toward Utamenai, disappearing into the frozen valley he had helped save. He survived. John Yancey would recover, earn a second Navy Cross, and return to Little Rock, Arkansas, to run his liquor store, a man who carried the scars of 3 wars within him. Hill 1282 remained in Marine hands, but the cost was staggering. And this was only the beginning. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir would rage on, consuming thousands of lives in a frozen hell few Americans ever talk about. But for those who were there, the memory never faded. In the cold silence of Korea's mountains, courage was measured not in victory, but in the refusal to surrender, even when survival seemed impossible.